Good afternoon to our virtual audience members. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with artist Jane Booth today. Jane's exhibition entitled Intuition is currently on view at the Daum Museum of Contemporary Art until December 20th of this year. My name is Tom Pichet and I'm the director of the Daum Museum, and I also curated Jane's current show here. A little housekeeping before we get going. This program, as you know, is streaming live on the Daum's Facebook page, but a recorded version will be available on both the Daum's website and State Fair Community College's YouTube channel after the event today. If you should have questions or comments during our discussion, please type them into the comment area on the Facebook page, and we'll get to them as we go along. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jane Booth. Hi, Jane.
Tom, I'm so glad to be here.
It's great to be seeing you virtually. Jane has been an active participant in the Kansas City art scene for a good number of years, as well as exhibiting her work throughout the Midwest and in California. Jane's paintings are included in over 16 private and corporate collections, as well as in the public collections of institutions such as the Albrecht Kemper Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri, the Beach Museum of Art in Manhattan, Kansas, and the Hunter Museum of Art in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Jane wasn't always a painter, however. She studied ceramics at Kansas State University and even has experience as both a steel cutter and welder. All this before turning her attention to the canvas. She studied painting privately with Philomene Bennett, who herself is an icon of the Kansas City art community. Today, Jane and I will conduct you viewers through a virtual tour of her current exhibition at the Daum. And we'll be speaking about a number of the works in the show and some of the stories that lie behind the paintings. The exhibition itself comprises 16 large-scale compositions, primarily acrylic on canvas, and they date from 2017 until the very end of 2019, which today seems like it was just like years ago, but they're brand new. Jane, many discussions of your work begin with a description of your fantastic studio and its setting in the rolling hills of eastern Kansas and the influence of that locale on your work. Can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe describe your studio and its vistas?
Yeah, my studio and home are located on a ridge that overlook a big valley. And it's just the air, the space, the visual space and the felt space, and being surrounded by the natural world that is so nourishing to me. It always has been. I just kind of came in that way. And building the studio, I used to be working in my living room and then a bedroom with the walls pushed out. My work kept getting bigger and bigger and kind of taking over the house. So in 2014, I built a studio, which is really just a simple metal building, but it's very tall and the lighting is beautiful. And it also creates that, of course, space itself, but there's that, there's just voluminous air, and out of every direction, there is nothing but wilderness. And it feeds me and it feeds my work.
Mm-hmm. Well, a number of your works have landscape feelings to them, if not actual elements. Is that something that you pick up on just by looking out the window and reflecting on what's all around you?
I think it must feed the work, but I don't ever consciously, none of my work is about ideas. I don't ever consciously think of painting what I'm seeing or painting even how something feels. It's more of being comfortable in this space and being tuned into the natural world, the migratory patterns, the wind, the huge wind today, everything that's living here, and then painting in a spontaneous or authentic way that is more instinctual than idea based. But oftentimes the paintings end up to be a bit journalistic, to look like my surroundings or look like something that I've been through. But it's not conscious, it's just got to come through. It's almost like, what's around you affects your psyche. And then that just needs to be an authentic work that comes from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that in addition to the landscape as a kind of maybe a muse is a good word for it, not an exact inspiration, but in addition to that, there are a couple of other main areas of inspiration. Among those are poetry and myth, and we've spoken together about your interest in the poets Rumi, the 13th century Persian mystic and poet, and Kabir, a 15th century Indian poet and mystic, as well as Sappho, the archaic Greek poet. Mm-hmm. And myths and legends. There are references to Icarus and Sinbad in the works in the exhibition. Yeah. If we go to the first slide, maybe we can start talking about how some of those ideas work their way into your compositions. Here we are looking into the first of the two rooms at the Daum. And this is the Scott Gallery, but for the purposes of this exhibition, we've been calling it the Rumi Room.
That was brilliant, Tom.
Not just for its alliterative appeal, but because there's poetry in all these works. Here we're having an overview of two of the paintings that we're going to be speaking about. Let's go to the next slide. And here's another installation photograph of two more works in the Rumi Room. And let's go to our third slide, and that will begin our distinct discussion. This is a composition entitled Island Journey Day 3 from 2019. You've spoken about the origin of this painting and the next painting as coming from time that you spent on an island on the Gulf Shore of southern Florida, and how you filtered your impressions of that landscape and a different landscape, also in light of the ecstatic poetry of Kabir and Rumi. Can you tell us a bit about this? Or maybe we need to go to the next photo too, just for a second. You sent me this one from your vacation travels, and I thought this captured, interestingly, the feeling of that Island Journey Day 2. Can you tell me the relationship between this painting or this photograph, actual photograph of the island area, and the painting Island Journey Day 3?
Let's go back to the painting. Yeah, so we rent a tiny cabin on a remote island in Florida, or we have for the last few years, and it's on stilts. And so I can set up a studio underneath the house, or fashion a studio, and a good weather studio. And it's very remote. We rarely see anyone else. And between the house and the ocean is simply beach and seagrasses, and there's this, so it's just this light blue sky and this deep blue ocean, and the beach that stretches on as long as the island. And it's just, everything is pale and light, and there is tons of life that is racing in front of you at all times. There's birds in the sky, there's the little shorebirds, there's stuff that gets washed up from the sea, there's a relentless surf that is coming in at all times, there's the wind, An osprey lives on the roof who you can hear calling all the time. And the life there is so different and the landscape is so different. And always my work is light that comes out of it. It always has that clear, clean background and spontaneous movement. And I can think of this as, it's actually called Island Journal. I painted 3 of them from that trip, one right after another. And it can almost be seen as a snapshot if you just froze life right there for a moment. But the process of painting it is very much more alive and spontaneous. And I love mark making. I love looking at handwriting and at graffiti. And this piece is full of that. Very spontaneous, quick, straight from the hand to the canvas. Nothing percolated down through the head or through a notion or through a concept, but just coming straight out. And in a way, it's conversational because one mark calls for another mark calls for another mark. These were just kind of ecstatic to paint, really, with the eyes full of the beach.
Well, I think that comes across. You know, one of the things I like about your work, and this is a kind of an exemplar of that, is they have this very public scale, they're large scale works, but then the mark making really brings it back into the intimate. And I felt in a way that we were going through your journals. You know, you call this the Island Journal, and there is that sense of that these are private notations and maybe things to remember later on, almost as if you're giving yourself little memos and then combining them all in the composition. So that's very appreciated, that quickness of the calligraphy and the sketchiness of the various passages really communicates that idea of journaling, I think.
Yeah.
Let's move forward. We have that beach photo where, again, you can sense, you know, there's the accumulation of objects and atmospheres. And, you know, that's why I love this photograph in relationship to that painting. But if we go forward to the next painting, this is a related work, and it's entitled Sappho's Mountain Hyacinths, also from 2019. And it's interesting. I know that poetry plays a role in your practice, but maybe not in the way that I thought initially, and maybe the way the viewers think. I know that Sappho in some of her collected fragments of poems, this one on love and desire, has written, like a hyacinth in the mountains that shepherds crush underfoot, even on the ground, a purple flower. But that's not really the inspiration for this, is it?
No, it was a look back, as it often is. This painting had 2 influences. It clearly came from the same time frame as the Island Journals did. So it was during or just after spending that quiet time in Florida. But also, I had just seen Cy Twombly's retrospective in New York. Yeah, I don't know if I had just seen it, but anyway, it was still alive in me. And there was a painting, that show was so fantastic. And I don't know what it is about Twombly. I love his work beyond reason. And I know it doesn't work for everybody, but I remember watching the elevator doors open when I was in New York in 1978 or 9 or something. And there was a Twombly show at the Whitney, and my heart just soared. I spent days in that show. And when I went back to New York, went to New York to see this show, it was the same way. And he had a painting there that referenced Sappho's Mountain Hyacinth. He was really big with Sappho. And it was so beautiful. I can't even tell you what it was about that painting. It was very simple, just this smush of purple and some handwriting that just came drifting off of the canvas. And it felt passionate and of the moment. And so I researched it like crazy, and then researched Sappho's poems, and just climbed in really and immersed in that. So when this painting came out, something about it felt like that, maybe some tiny little portion of it. But so the title always comes after the painting is done, and I'm looking at it to see what it is that it calls forth. And that memory certainly is indelibly burned into my soul.
Mhm. And Twombly is one of those other areas of inspiration for you, along with a number of other artists who I think we'll talk about when we get to the next room. But it's good to keep him in mind. And we can certainly see that calligraphy is that type of calligraphy is important to you, especially if we go to the next slide. This one more directly connected to poetry. This is an installation shot that shows the multi-panel piece, Kabir's Swans from 2018. And you see it in the gallery. And then if we go to the next slide, we'll get a closer view of it. This set of 9 canvases is accompanied by another composition where you have handwritten out a poem by Kabir. And if you don't mind, I'll read that through so that our audience can know what it is you were thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Swan, I'd like you to tell me your whole story. When you first appeared and what dark sand you were going toward, and where you sleep at night and what you are looking for. It's morning, Swan, wake up, climb in the air, follow me. I know of a country that spiritual flatness does not control, nor constant depression, and those alive are not afraid to die. There, wildflowers come up through the leafy floor, and the fragrance of I am she floats on the wind. There, the bee of the heart stays deep inside the flower and cares for no other thing. And as we look at this closely, we can see that in addition to the gestural and abstract mark making that's going on, you've also written over the various panels the poem. You've written out the poem. Some panels only have a word or two. The 8th panel has a much larger bit of text. But I was saying to you before, I love the way that the calligraphic element of the written word harmonizes and it expands your gestural abstract mark making. Can you tell us about how that poem and this work came together?
Well, thanks for reading it. That brings it back to me. So this painting is different from all of the rest because that poem was in mind, and it was just a raw exercise of canvases pinned up on the wall. And I'd been reading that poem, and Kabir, the thing I love about Kabir is he is always just saying, right now, what are you sleeping? What are you waiting for? Join God, wake up, come out to the street. And it's always, it's so immediate. And, for me, it's a universal message of don't make those plans, just start now, open up. And the spiritual flatness that he references, the poem just deeply affected me. And so it was really, it kind of came out very, very spontaneously. I don't think I even looked back to adjust it, which almost never happens. I just did it for me, and someone suggested that I stretch them. So I thought it ended up to carry some of that, carry some of that message.
And then thinking back to the side Twombly, Untitled to Sappho, it has some of that quality of where he just took a passage of paint and then used his hand to describe the poem.
Yeah, right. Well, the handwriting is so much, handwriting is mark making. And we're kind of losing that. We hardly make our own notes anymore, but I really love handwriting that's just scattered off somewhere, or you know, compositionally, we play with it a little bit, I think, when we're writing. So anyway, it was all of the same piece in this painting, the visual and the words.
If we move on to another painting in this gallery, the Music of the Inner Universe, and here we see it installed. You didn't initially intend it to be on two different walls. It's a diptych.
Right.
And if we go to the next slide, we'll see it more clearly related. Here we have it. And the Music of the Inner Universe comes from a line in another poem by Kabir. Listen, friend, this body is his dulcimer. He draws the strings tight, and out of it comes the music of the inner universe. If the string breaks and the bridge falls, then this dulcimer of dust goes back to dust. Take your seat on the 1,000 petals of the lotus, and there gaze on the infinite beauty.
I loved reading these, Tom.
The poem came second for you in this case, didn't it?
It did.
Talk about having a very smooth experience painting this work, an unusual experience, I think.
Yeah, it was extremely unusual. This process, that painting came out almost all in one piece. I think all in one piece, except for the next day when I think that black was pushed back a little bit with the white marks. But it just, how does that happen? In the first place, isn't it 25 feet wide? And so I can't even see the whole thing at one time. Of course, there's this back and forth that you do, but as I remember, it just kind of came pouring out. It wasn't split when I painted it. It was all on one canvas. But I thought that the split helped it. But anyway, so it's just very airy. There isn't any heaviness to it. There isn't really anything holding it to the ground. And 3 or 4 more marks and it would have become something else entirely. So when I stared at it for days afterwards, because it seemed so spare and surely there was something else to do, but there just wasn't anything else to do. And so then I turned back, this was just this huge Kabir period of time, but I would rifle through Kabir looking for titles, which is really how I got more deeply involved with it. So I was looking for a title that felt like this, and the Music of the Inner Universe, that poem, he's talking about this dulcimer is like this body and the universe comes through it. It's something that I know artists of all kinds talk about that. It's hard to talk about, but there's more of a getting out of the way, and then getting out of the way, I think, of your head, and then just allowing this body, this dulcimer, tighten the strings and play. And then when the strings loosen or break and the dulcimer falls apart, you drop to ashes yourself and you're done. And so it seemed like a great title for the poem. It was a title for the painting. It was like the painting evoked the poem and the poem evoked the painting. It was really wonderful to paint that piece.
What does splitting a composition into 2 panels do you think? What is the outcome of that?
I just have never done that before with a mild painting like that. I have with an intensely marked painting, because sometimes if you separate it, it allows you to see detail. But in this one, it felt like these were these 2 distinct phases. Like this was one moment. I'm pointing at my computer screen. The one on the left was one moment, and the one on the right was the next. And it was just more pleasing. I put a barrier up on that in the studio and stared at it for a long time. It's scary to split it, but it worked. Yeah.
It's as if the work is having an internal conversation, I think.
It is.
Between two aspects. Well, that is the roomy room. Let's move on to the large room in the Fried Gallery. And here we have an overview of the Fried Gallery, and we're looking south from the previous room that we were in. And we'll be talking about a number of these paintings. Let's go to the next slide. Here we are looking north in the Fried Gallery. And I hope people are noticing something in the middle of the floor. If we go to the next slide, I think that comes into greater focus.
Oops, there's one more.
And then there is we're looking at the piece on the floor now, which is entitled Instinct. Here you get a sense of it. It's a large scale piece, as you can see. It's 25 feet long and 7 feet across, roughly. And let's go to the next slide, and that will give us up. And here it is. This is the way I saw it originally. This talks about how big your studio is. This was pinned up on the wall, 25 feet long, pinned up on the wall with two partners. It was a triptych. There was this painting, Instinct, then there was Instinct Transcendent, and the third, Instinct Embodiment. How do you feel about having this separated from the other two? How does that work for you?
Well, as it worked out, I think it's the only one that we brought. Someday I'd love to see it hang, the three 25-footers all together, because of sort of the story that they tell. But this is the one that, there was a series called Instinct, which is the title of the show, and is the thing that is maybe the best description of what I try to talk about with the work. It's working instinctively. It's working from not just like wild frenzy, not just like senseless frenzy, but it's more of something innate that is a wisdom that can operate like like animals do. They don't have language, or like a coyote is moving. They're not planning to get up and get 3 rabbits for their 2 hungry children, but they get up and move in this way, and it makes sense. And life is sustained that way, and it's a deep wisdom, is the way I see Instinct. And so, not to call any attention to my instinct, but it's just our instinct as living beings. And these 3 pieces they described distinct phases of what the first one was transcendence, and the second one was, oh God, I can't think of the name of it. Embodiment. And then the third one is the manifest, which is, it's just a universal term across all spiritual practices. And the manifest is when you go out into the world and use what has happened to you. And so this is the grounding piece. And for you to choose it, and then for you guys to have the idea to stretch it out on the floor was brilliant, because when it's 25 feet high, you can't see the top of it. I should show them with binoculars or something, but on the floor, you can walk up and down and you can see every mark and have an experience, like walking along a river or something. And having it in the center of the gallery, your vision was so beautiful to just have the paintings and have space. But like we talked about, that space is so big, to have this river of brown running along the center of it was just brilliant. I just loved what you did with it. It held up fine by itself.
Well, I love the way it looks as well. And I think that I had recently been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and visited their new Islamic arts wing. And they have a number of gigantic carpets that they've installed in their installation, and set out on the floor as they would be, raised, but set out as they would be originally. And so this was reminding me of that tradition of the Persian garden carpets, the Garden of Paradise idea. And these were carpets that were meant to mimic these beautiful walled gardens that the rich Persians were able to construct for themselves and meant to look like the Garden of Paradise in heaven. And they included flora and exotic flora and fauna and water features. And to me, walking around this has that same idea that there are objects interacting. There's a sense of nature, I think, embedded in it. And it just holds that room. I think it really fills the room. Let's move on to our next. Here we have an installation view of the next two works we're going to talk about. And that's me talking to our members of our docent corps back in January, just before the exhibition opened. And we're going to be talking about After Dark in Spirit, which is on top, and After Dark in Body, which is on bottom. Let's go to the next slide. And here it is, After Dark in Spirit. And you've also pointed out some unique aspects of this painting in your career.
Yeah, the fact about the studio and the space that you were asking about when we began, one thing that has happened dramatically when I built the studio after having worked in these shelled out parts of buildings is the space is so big that I began to paint bigger and bigger and bigger. And this work does not look that big in the studio, nor does it in the museum, but these are sort of almost like smaller pieces, and they're 12 feet wide. I think they're 6 feet tall. They might be a little shorter than that. Yeah. So anyway, this was meant to be a diptych. I had mixed up a bunch of old paints and spilled a huge amount of this. I had about 4 gallons of it, and I spilled a huge amount of it on the studio floor, had these 2 canvases out. So I used warehouse brooms for some of these larger pieces. And you can see that mark making in this one. It just came, it was very spontaneous, and there was an eye on the whole. I was working on the floor, so I could really kind of see all of it and what was happening. There's various points of wetness and dryness on the canvas that cause the paint to scatter a little bit or to hold a sharp line. And this one was really fluid, and you can see there's no marks. There were a few dripped red paint after the fact of using this broom, but it was really, there's just no mark making on it at all. It's all color filled. It's an active color field, but it's color filled. But then the second one.
Let's go to that next slide, yes.
The second one was done, you can see the broom. Did I just freeze for you? Anyway, the broom marks were still here, but I tacked this one up on the wall and began to put these marks. It's kind of like the human experience is here, and the one prior is called After Dark in Spirit, and this one is called After Dark in Body. This one is more carnal and busy and anguished and fraught with things and joyful, and it just has more it's got more human, it's got more body in it. And and I came upon those titles, of course, after the fact too, but the prior one, we could take a quick glimpse at it.
Let's go back one. Can we go back to the previous slide?
There it is. You can see how they feel so different. And when Tom, when you curated this show, you weren't sure exactly how you were going to place these until the work was delivered, and then you had that insight to place this one, the 2 of them stacked on a wall, and so the In Spirit is above and the In Body is below, and they speak to each other. I'd hung them next to each other before, but having one on top of the other made them feel richer and more whole.
Let's go back one more slide to that installation of the 2 of them. You know, Jane, this is something else, another influence that I wanted to discuss. Some of the artists that have been important to you, and Cy Twombly certainly is right up there. But from my point of view, and because of the collection at the Daum, color field painters who you just mentioned, people like Helen Frankenthaler are certainly important to the Daum. We have some very important paintings by her. And then the idea that you're working on the floor with the broom, with the soak stain, there seemed to be a direct ancestral link between you and work of some of the color field people.
Well, I love Helen Frankenthaler, and I have studied her greatly, and she was a prominent feature in the Ninth Street Women. I don't know how many of you have read that book, but it's a tremendous book about the abstract expressionists. But to tell you the truth, the color field actually originated because I was in a hurry to get going, and to gesso the canvas to me is just mind-numbing. And I was in this workshop with Philomene Bennett, who was so important to me those years ago. And I just put plastic down on the floor, and I had leftover paints, and that first raw, and I had the raw canvas. I poured some different things that were sort of left over into it, and was just fascinated by what happened when one color met another, or when part of the canvas was dry and part of the canvas was wet. And so I painted that way for a little while. I didn't want to look at Frankenthaler's work because I knew about her, but I just wanted to see what this was like without having an idea or an image of someone else's that was in the forefront. And but then, you know, of course, since then I've turned to her work and love it and appreciate it.
Let's keep moving through the gallery. If we go ahead a couple of slides to the, and there we are. Here's another installation shot, and this time we're focused on By the Light of the Moon, which is that blue painting in front of the docents. And let's go one more slide, and there we have a good image of it. Once again, a poem helped with the title. And because I'm liking reading all this poetry today, I'll...
Great.
This one, Edward Lear, and it's from his poem, The Owl and the Pussycat, which I think many of us might know. In particular, and hand in hand on the edge of the sand, they danced by the light of the moon, the moon, the moon. They danced by the light of the moon. But again, that came afterwards.
It did. It did, but it was the painting feels like that part of the poem, that last little piece. There was a runcible spoon. Anyway, that last little piece of that poem is just so, you know, they're just disappearing in that moonlight. And this painting was really different. And I don't paint often with these deep blue backgrounds, but this gorgeous turquoise that came out of mixing paint, laid onto raw canvas, which was laid out on concrete, which I think had something to do with it. There was a little bit of graphite in it, and the way the pigments hit on that concrete, the pigments scattered, and you can see in the background of the painting those little, it's like underwater, there's just movement, there's little shooting stars, or there's all that activity. And it was so fascinating to me, just as it was, that I pinned it up on the studio wall. I just couldn't make a mark on it. I mean, how could it be better than that? But it wasn't, you know, it wasn't quite right to stretch and hang. So I just gradually tiptoed into this painting and put some of these sort of cloudy marks, stared at it again, a few more marks, stared at it again. I spent way more time looking at this painting than I did painting this painting. And in fact, I think it was 2 or 3 years after the initial wash went down that it was actually done. It was like one last frenetic afternoon, and it was done.
Jane, can you check your camera? You seem to have disappeared.
Yeah, I know. I froze and then it disappeared and turned into my... There, now I just Yeah, it's something with the computer.
All right, well,
Hide non-video, hide self-view. Sorry about that.
The other, I like that you talk about the length of time you take with a piece um, in the process and afterwards. Let's go to the next slide. And here we have an installation photo looking back at Because the Sun Shines. And let's go one more and we'll get a better view of it. This is from 2018. You spoke about atmospheres in some of your writings. And so I have two questions for you on this one. I understand this one took you a very long time to complete. And also, what do you mean by atmospheres when in talking about your paintings?
Well, it's interesting for me. I wonder, I think it's probably like this for most artists, but to look at a painting can bring back, it can bring back what was happening when it was painted and what time of year and what it smelled like. And this painting is really visceral for me. It was done in February and my big voluminous studio catches that north wind. It's really cold in the winter. And so I'm always bundled up and fighting the cold a little bit. So I'm getting to the answer to your question. So the atmosphere began as these rich yellows and oranges, I think to just create some warmth, really. Mm-hmm. It often happens in the teeth of winter that these really yellow ones come forth. So the atmosphere to me is like, so to put it in a literal landscape, say that you're looking across a valley and it's the color, it's the gloaming, it's that soft blue, it's the color that everything is living in. It's the rain or the bright and it gives it its air. It's where it kind of lives. And then the marks are what are animated, what the life is that is within that scene. And this piece, those warm colors, I don't even know I've tried to do that again. Sometimes they just come together. But those really rich, warm colors were pretty captivating and it was scary to make any more marks on it. So yeah, it started with that bow tie, that gray bow tie. Mm-hmm. And once that happened, of course, just the idyllic golden field was destroyed. So I had a little freedom to go back in and mark on it some more, make more marks and more washes. It still didn't feel quite right. This is a great painting to look at for sort of push-pull in space. So I keep talking about space, but you can look at that yellow and see that's just the very furthest away thing, the yellow. Mm-hmm. And even the yellow at the bottom, the deeper yellow seems, I can't think of the name of that color. It seems to come even a little bit closer. And then each mark that you make, it lands somewhere in space. So that bow tie, when it was the only thing, it was just right on the very front. You make a mark on top of that bow tie and the bow tie pushes back a little bit. And the mark that you make is in front. So in a way, to paint is this push-pull in space of placing things in depth, in a certain amount of depth. And I think it was almost done, but it didn't quite have the life that I wanted it to have. And the last mark, maybe a year later, was that gold spray paint that's up in the middle high left, mm-hmm. middle left. Anyway, so I don't know if you can imagine what it looked like without that. For some reason, that one mark made the whole thing, it just made it a little more cohesive. So yeah, that one took a long time.
Cohesive, but and also adding something very different to it, because the spray paint certainly has a different texture, hand feel.
It totally does. It's such a weird mark, and it's metallic. It's a gold metallic mark.
But it adds, it's the perfect fillip for the...
Like a little being.
Yes. We have a couple more to look at. Let's go to our next installation. Here we're looking south, and we're going to be speaking about the painting that's in the middle of those three on the wall. And one more installation. And here we have one of your most recent paintings, at least in terms of this show, Polympsys, Lucid Dreams from 2019. If we go one more, I think we'll see it all by itself. There we are.
Yeah, okay, well, that was a whole new direction. And that I just wanted to use up some student canvases. And what a lucky thing. I pulled out some old canvases that that were never going to be resolved, and stretched them and put just like oops house paint on it. So everything was sort of free. The house paint, I slathered on it and left pieces of it that showed through from the old canvas, which is hence the name Polympsys, which means, partially covered or history showing through, something along those lines. And a friend had given me a case of this graphite paint, spray paint. And so everything was free. So I went in the studio and just began to paint with total abandon, with no care, no stops, just no hesitation. And they all came across as very sort of childlike and confident. I never had the idea that I would show them, but of course that's when the best work is done, when you're just in discovery play mode. Those marks, those graphite marks, those black curly marks, were inspired by a painter that I've been really interested in, or was really interested in for a while, Albert Olin. He's a German painter, and I was looking into his work and was looking for exhibitions and where he was showing, and he had a show in England, a huge show in England, and it was all based on the influence of this guy named John Graham, who was a philosopher in New York, moved to New York. He was a wild man, had been in the military and did cartwheels on his horse when he was riding into battle. Anyway, he was just a crazy character. And he painted fairly poorly, but he was marvelously philosophical and wrote a manifesto for the artists of that time as image was beginning to break up and move into abstraction. So Olin got fascinated with Graham, so I started looking at Graham's work. And so these marks, if you ever look at that show, you will see they're straight from that influence as well. It was a great ride, though, because I got to read the philosophy of Graham and what he thought about the abstract expressionists. And so anyway, that's a big story, but this series is there's probably 8 paintings in them, and they were hot off the press, right, Tom, when you picked them?
So for listeners or watchers of the program, you might want to look up John Graham's his composition called Terrifying Sunset, which has the feel of this painting, and as well as the next one. Let's go to that last slide. This is Little Violet. That openness and the kind of surreal accumulation of abstract imagery. But imagery, it's abstract, and yet it's a little more anecdotal maybe than you often are.
It really is. That's just a painting all of its own. Yeah, I'm just kind of taking it in as I'm looking at it.
Those comb forms, or those, and then the curlicue lines, and he has that handlebar mustache in his,
That's it.
his painting, Terrifying Sunset.
You found the one.
I love that you've taken off from that.
Yeah, those are the first marks, and the rest of them come in later. But it's really different. It's more of a design and childlike and sort of,
and maybe a decorative quality that that you avoid in some of the other work.
That's right, exactly.
The other thing I like about, I have noticed about these two paintings, you typically paint on unsized canvas And in these two, because you're painting on top of older works, the older work acts almost as a gesso, and so the way that light interacts with these compositions is very different from the way they do on the way light interacts with the unsized canvases, where there's an absorption that goes on, and here there's a bouncing of light.
That's the
Is
truth.
that something you think about, or is that just what happened?
No, I love that observation. It was so completely different to work with it because it stands on top of the canvas, and those pure color fields are completely matte. They are just absolutely flat, and these have more texture. And it was just anytime that I switch things up like this, and then there's just different problems to solve, that puts me into a sort of a discovery mode where I don't really know what I'm doing outside of my normal patterns. That's a really, really good place for me to be. That's what these were for me. Just a completely different way of working. This was all brushwork.
Since these are the last two works before the pandemic, how have things gone forward?
Well, things sort of screeched to a halt for a while. I was sort of frozen in my tracks. And I'm back in the studio now, and got back in the studio over the summer productively. I haven't ever quit working in terms of sketching or small works, but yeah, I'm in another mode of discovery. So it's fun to play with. I'm in a good spot.
Jane, we have a question from one of our audience members. And the question is, how do you feel about music of the inner universe being on two walls?
I thought it was quite graceful. You and I had talked about stretching it across. Oh no, that was a different idea. No, I really liked it. They still felt of a piece. And when the way that those walls are angled, they're not 90 degree, but much wider than that.
Yes.
It felt a little encompassing, so you could stand between those two walls and take it all in. I really loved it.
Yeah, I thought it worked. And I've done that before with other things that could also just go on a wall quite near each other. But because the angle is more oblique, it reads in a way almost as a single space.
It does.
Jane, we've done it. You've disappeared, but I know you're there. This is our first virtual, this is the Daum's first virtual conversation. We're learning as we go along. And I hope that the audience has gotten as much enjoyment out of our conversation as I have. And I hope it's been meaningful for you as well.
Tom, it's been so fun to talk to you all along the way. And I just can't tell you, I've told you over and over, the way that you've curated the show, the work is showing as well as it possibly could. It's just been a real joy. I've loved all of our conversations along the way.
Great. And we're very thankful of your willingness to share it with us, and especially to share it with us over such an extended period. It's
been a long, weird year.
And we were closed between March and August, but we went into the museum. We took turns going into the museum daily to make sure everything was all right with our physical plant. And I can't tell you, I never grew tired of walking through your two galleries and seeing the work by myself usually. Sometimes not with the lights on, just with the ambient light. Mm-hmm. And it's held up month after month after month. So I think that's my test for the significance of artworks. How does it hold up over time?
Oh, that's wonderful. I love to think about that.
Yeah. Jane, thank you so much. And I'll look forward to seeing you before too long.
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.